There's a moment, and I think anyone who was in Orientation Hall 7 that morning will tell you the same thing, where the air just stopped, like the whole room collectively forgot how to breathe. I've been trying to find the right words for 3 standard cycles now. I've written drafts, deleted them, started over. My bunkmate Viareth keeps telling me to just say what I saw, plain and simple, no decoration. "You were there," she says. "That's enough." She's right, I was there. So let me tell you what happened on the day that changed everything. Set up Calthurin Station, Outer Rim Enrollment Processing Hub. Calthurin Station isn't beautiful. I want to be upfront about that. If you've ever read the recruitment brochures, the ones with the soft blue lighting and the wide corridors full of cadets from 100 different species walking together in some kind of perfect harmony, forget all of it. Someone with an artistic license and very little honesty made those. The real Calthurin is loud, overcrowded, and smells vaguely of 3 different kinds of organic waste, depending on which corridor you're standing in. It's a processing hub. That's the honest word for it. They take young recruits from 37 recognized species across the galactic cooperative, run them through 16 days of enrollment testing, psychological profiling, language implant calibration, and basic physical assessment, and then they sort them into academies. It's efficient. It's also relentless. By day 4, half the cadets look like they've already fought a war. I arrived on a shuttle from Pelion IV, which means I'd been traveling for 6 days before I even set foot in the station. 6 days in a transport vessel with no artificial gravity stabilization and recycled air that tasted like the inside of a metal glove. By the time I stepped onto the docking ring, my legs were uncertain under me and my primary sensory organs were running at about 60%. My name is Calith. I'm Peliony, which means I have 4 arms, 2 of which are primarily sensory rather than motor, and a skeletal structure that's cartilage-heavy and extremely flexible. We're mid-range on most physical metrics. Not fragile, not extraordinary. We've been in the cooperative for 200 years, and nobody has ever made a fuss about us, which is exactly how we prefer it. I mention all of this because it matters. When I tell you about what happened in Orientation Hall 7, I want you to understand the context I was bringing to it. I was tired. I was still recalibrating from transit, and I was, like every other cadet there, completely unprepared. Enrollment day 1 starts early. They don't ease you in. The station AI triggers the dormitory lighting at what translates to approximately 4 in the morning local time, and you have 40 minutes to report to your assigned orientation hall in clean enrollment whites. I made it with 6 minutes to spare. Hall 7 holds about 300 cadets when it's at functional capacity. That morning it was at 280, give or take. I did a rough count while I was looking for a seat because counting things is what I do when I'm anxious. It's a Pelion-y thing. Numbers are calm. Numbers don't shift on you. The hall is tiered, long curved rows of seats arranged in a descending semicircle facing a central floor space, and a raised presentation platform. Species accommodating seating, which means you've got standard configuration benches, reclined rest frames for Dorican cadets who can't sustain upright posture for long periods, a fluid suspension alcove on the far left for the 2 Marathi cadets who breathe liquid, and a reinforced floor section in the back right corner designated for species whose body mass exceeds standard structural tolerances. I found a seat in the 4th row, next to a Viareth. That's what I thought her name was then, though I later learned Viareth is actually a Solan greeting that she'd mistakenly introduced herself with. Her real name is a tonal sequence that doesn't translate into most languages, so she kept Viareth anyway. She's blue-gray, 4-eyed, about a head shorter than me, and she'd already figured out how to rig her enrollment kit reading tablet to display 3 information streams simultaneously. I liked her immediately. "You see the board," she whispered, nodding toward the scheduling display at the front. I looked. The day's roster listed: welcome address, administrative enrollment processing, initial physical baseline assessment, species orientation briefing, and then, at the bottom, in the smaller font that usually means they added it late, open assessment. Voluntary demonstration period. "What's the voluntary demonstration?" I asked. Viareth shrugged all 4 of her upper appendages. "No idea. First time I've seen it listed." Around us, the hall was filling up. The noise was something else. 300 different biological vocal ranges overlapping, translation implants working overtime, the occasional sharp click or vibration from species that communicate in frequencies outside standard auditory range. It was the kind of sound that isn't quite sound, more like pressure. Like the room itself was alive and undecided about what it wanted to be. I remember noticing the human cadets when they came in, though not for any dramatic reason. Not yet. There were 9 of them in Hall 7 that morning. I know the exact number because after everything that happened, I went back and counted them in my memory the way you do when a detail suddenly becomes important. 9 humans. They came in together, not in a tight group, but in the loose, comfortable proximity of people who'd already found each other on the transit shuttle and established an informal pack structure. They were easy to identify, standard bilateral symmetry, average height for a mid-range species, skin tones varying across the warm-to-cool spectrum, those distinctive forward-facing eyes that give them their particular kind of locked-in visual focus. They spread out across the hall without any visible coordination. I noticed one of them sat 2 rows directly in front of me and to the left. She was quiet, compact. She sat down, arranged her kit with economical movements, and then went still in a way that I now recognize but didn't then. I didn't think anything of her. I want to be honest about that. I didn't think anything of any of them. The briefing that planted the seed. The welcome address was delivered by Station Coordinator Pelhex, an older Doricon whose translation implant had developed a slight audio lag, so everything she said arrived about half a second after her mouth moved. 300 cadets sat there experiencing a very mild but persistent sense of unreality for 40 minutes, while she walked us through station protocols, academic expectations, the cooperative's founding principles, and a lengthy section on interspecies conduct standards that included a detailed breakdown of what constitutes a threat gesture in each of the 37 recognized species. It was thorough. It was also, and I say this with respect for Coordinator Pelhex's evident dedication, extraordinarily dull. But then she said something. She was wrapping up the interspecies conduct section, cycling through the last few species on the list, and she paused at a section header and said, "Humans, behavioral conduct note. Cadets are reminded that humans are a standard threat category 2 species as assessed under the Cooperative Physical Capability Registry. There are no special conduct protocols for human cadets beyond those already outlined in the General Code. Standard threat category 2. I'd never thought about it before, but hearing it said aloud in an official briefing made me actually consider what that meant. Category 1 species are those assessed as having no significant independent threat capability, usually small-bodied, low-strength, no notable environmental resilience. Category 2 was the broad middle category. Most species were Category 2. It meant functional, capable, unremarkable. Additionally, Coordinator Pelhex continued, cadets may have encountered cultural references during pre-enrollment research to a concept called Deathworlders. This term appears in certain outdated academic papers, and in some fringe xenobiology circles to describe a hypothetical category of species originating from high lethality home environments that would theoretically produce biological characteristics significantly exceeding standard parameters. She paused, the room was listening. For clarity, this classification does not exist within official cooperative taxonomy. There is no recognized Deathworlder category. The concept is theoretical, has never been substantiated by peer-reviewed xenobiological assessment, and should be treated as cultural mythology rather than scientific fact. If you have questions about species capability classifications, refer to the official registry. Are there any questions on this section? A Kelvari cadet 2 rows ahead of me raised a secondary limb. Can you clarify, is the Deathworlder classification being actively studied, or has it been formally rejected? Formally set aside, Coordinator Pelhex said, with the careful precision of someone who's been trained to not say the word rejected in case it sounds like an absolute. The registry is a living document. Classifications are reviewed periodically, but there is currently no active reclassification process for any human-adjacent category. The Kelvari cadet lowered their limb. Viarith leaned over. They brought it up just to dismiss it, she whispered. That's interesting. Why? Because if it was actually nothing, they wouldn't have needed to bring it up. I thought about that for a moment. Then the briefing moved on to dietary accommodation schedules, and I put it away. I wouldn't think about it again for about 4 hours. The physical baseline assessment. After lunch, if you can call the nutrient blocks they issued in the Hall 7 catering bay lunch, we moved to the assessment track. The physical baseline assessment isn't designed to challenge anyone. That's genuinely not its purpose. It's a calibration exercise. The station needs raw data on each cadet's physical parameters to set appropriate safety thresholds for training equipment, to flag any medical considerations, and to generate preliminary capability profiles for academy placement advisors. You're not supposed to try hard. You're just supposed to be measured. The track itself is a long oval running circuit on level 3, with embedded sensors in the floor, walls, and air at regular intervals. Each cadet runs the circuit alone at their own pace, while sensors record movement speed, oxygen processing rate, joint articulation range, muscle force output, and a dozen other metrics depending on species-specific relevant factors. There are no judges watching. There are no ranks being assigned. It's just data. Most cadets treat it exactly that way. They walk or glide or undulate around the track at a comfortable pace and let the sensors do their work. I remember watching the human cadets cycle through. It was open format, so we could observe other cadets' runs if we were waiting for our own assessment slot. I was in the 3rd rotation group, so I had time. 7 of the 9 human cadets came through in the 2nd rotation. They moved the way you'd expect, steady, upright, economical, nothing remarkable. A couple of them were faster than average, a couple slower. The sensors didn't flag anything unusual. Their profiles compiled and they moved on. The 8th human cadet was a tall male with a quiet manner and a slight drag in his left leg that suggested an old structural injury. He ran the circuit in a careful, considered way, like someone who's learned to work around something. His data came back Category 2 standard, maybe slightly below average on propulsion metrics due to the injury, slightly above on endurance. And then the last human cadet came to the track. Third. She was in the 3rd rotation, same as me, which is why I was watching. I'd seen her in the hall earlier, the quiet one, 2 rows ahead. She was average height for a human, which means she was slightly below average for the general cadet population. Her hair was pulled back in a tight functional arrangement. She had a particular way of standing, weight slightly forward, like she was about to move before she decided to. She stepped onto the track. She looked at the starting sensor pad for a moment, just a moment. Something in her expression shifted slightly, not tension exactly, more like attention, like she just turned something on behind her eyes. And then she ran. I don't have the right words for this in Peliony. I'm working in translated cooperative standard for this account, which gives me slightly more vocabulary to work with, but I'm still not sure I can describe it accurately. She was fast. That's the baseline fact. She was fast in a way that the 7 human cadets before her had not been. But that alone doesn't explain what happened. Because the sensors had already measured cadets faster than her that day, Kelvari cadets, who are built for sprint locomotion, and one Dorani cadet who moves in a way that looks slow but covers enormous distances per cycle. What made people look up was the quality of it, the totality of it. She ran like she meant every single stride, like her whole body had been built for exactly this one thing and had been waiting all morning to do it. There was no wasted movement, no settling in, no finding rhythm. She just was the rhythm from the first step. Her breathing, which the open-track audio pickups were capturing, was controlled and deep and perfectly metered. And her face was the most unsettling part in retrospect, because it was completely calm. Other cadets run assessments with various expressions: effort, discomfort, concentration. The Kelvari sprinter had looked like he was flying and loved it. The human with the leg injury had looked focused. Most of us look like whatever we're doing. She looked like she was thinking about something else. Like running at that pace was happening automatically in a part of her that didn't need her conscious attention. She finished the circuit, the sensors compiled, she stepped off the track. I looked at Viarith. Viarith was looking at the assessment coordinator, a young Solon male in a station-issue gray uniform who was staring at his tablet with the very specific expression of a person who has just seen something they don't know how to file. He looked up, he looked at the human cadet, he looked back at his tablet, he started typing something quickly. Viarith, I said quietly. I saw it, she said. What did you see? She was quiet for a second. I don't know exactly, but something. Build tension. What started happening in the afternoon? Here's the thing about Calthurin Station. It runs on a very finely calibrated schedule. Every element of the enrollment process has a time slot, a purpose, and a clearly defined administrative pathway. The whole machine runs because each part does its job exactly when and how it's supposed to. So when things start going slightly off schedule, you notice. The afternoon was structured around species orientation briefings. These are the species-specific sessions where you go to a smaller room with the other cadets from your planet or species group, and a specialist runs you through the particular considerations that apply to you. Medical protocols, cultural accommodation notes, any specialized equipment you'll need access to, that sort of thing. I went to the Peliony session. Fine, standard, 20 minutes. When I came out, the corridor was different. Not different in any visible way. The walls were the same polished gray-white. The overhead lighting was the same even, cool blue. The cadets moving through were the same mix of species and sizes and colors that they'd been all morning. But something in the texture of the crowd had changed. There was a new frequency in the background murmur. I caught fragments as I walked. Assessment coordinator flagged it for review. Category 2, they said, but the force output reading was. I heard they had to recalibrate the sensors because they thought it was a malfunction. Which one? The small female. I was watching, I didn't see anything special. You weren't looking at the right data. The endurance projection is what? I stopped a Kelvari cadet I vaguely recognized from the morning's run. What's happening? What's the sensor recalibration about? The Kelvari cadet, tall, copper-colored with the elongated limbs of her species, looked at me with 2 of her 4 eyes. One of the human cadets flagged in the physical assessment. Unusual data. The coordinator submitted it to the central registry for review, and apparently the registry kicked it back and said to recalibrate the sensors and run it again because the readings weren't consistent with Category 2 parameters. They're saying the sensors were wrong. That's the official position. What's the unofficial position? She was quiet for a moment. That the sensors were right. I found Viorith by our dormitory block. She'd somehow already obtained a partial summary of the flagged assessment data. She had a talent for finding information that impressed and slightly alarmed me in equal measure. The force output readings, she said, pulling up her tablet. When she was running, the floor sensors measured her foot impact force at a level that's look. For reference, average Peliony mid-run impact force is around here. She indicated a figure. Kelvari, who are fast runners, are up here. The standard Category 2 human ceiling is just above Kelvari. Standard maximum observed, accounting for outliers, is here. She paused, let me look. Then she indicated a number further up the scale. Her readings were here, repeatedly, consistently, not a spike, a sustained average. And her bone density scanned that the sensors ran as part of the baseline. It flagged unusual density in the long bones, much higher than standard human parameters. Which means what exactly? Viorith set the tablet down. It means either the sensors are wrong or the official classification is wrong. They're saying the sensors are wrong. Yes, she said, they are saying that. We went to dinner in the main cadet mess. The human cadets were at a long table near the west wall. I noticed them without meaning to. Everyone was noticing them without meaning to. That specific kind of not looking that is actually very close attention. Most of them seemed unaware of the undercurrent. They were doing what cadets do at dinner, eating, talking, adjusting to the overwhelming novelty of being surrounded by 36 species other than your own. The tall human with the leg injury was laughing at something the cadet across from him was saying. A couple of the others were studying their enrollment kits. She was there, quiet. She was eating quite a lot, which I noticed in a detached sort of way. Humans are caloric creatures. I knew that in a general sense, but watching her systematically work through what seemed like twice the standard nutrient allocation was striking when you held it against the earlier data in your mind. She ate like someone refueling after significant expenditure. She also kept her back to the wall. I noticed that. She'd chosen a seat at the end of the bench, against the room's outer wall where she could see most of the space. Her eyes moved regularly, smoothly, sweeping the room in a pattern that looked almost automatic. It didn't look like paranoia. It looked like habit. Like a very old habit. Across the table from me, a Dorani cadet named Cheval was talking. Cheval was big. Dorani are the largest species in the cooperative on average. 7 to 8 feet of dense biological material that looks intimidating right up until you speak to them, at which point they reveal themselves to be among the most gentle-natured beings you'll ever meet. Cheval had an enormous head and 2 small, very expressive eyes, and a voice that made my secondary sensory arms vibrate at the low end. "I spoke to one of them," Cheval said very quietly. "Earlier, the one who ran." We were all immediately focused on this. "What did she say?" Virith asked. I asked her how she trained for her fitness level. Cheval's small eyes moved. She looked at me like she wasn't sure what I was asking. Then she said she didn't do any special training. She said where she grew up, that was just normal. Silence at the table. "Where does she come from?" someone asked. "I didn't ask," Cheval said. "I thought it might be strange to ask, but she said something that I've been thinking about. She said, I didn't know we were going to be assessed. I was going easy." The silence had a different texture after that. The voluntary demonstration period. They'd listed it at the bottom of the schedule in small font. Open assessment, voluntary demonstration period. 7 in the evening, back in Hall 7, attendance optional. When I walked in at 6:55, there were 260 cadets already there, out of 280 enrolled in Hall 7. Voluntary. The floor space at the center of the hall, which had been empty during the morning briefing, had been rearranged. There were several assessment stations set up, a structured materials testing rig, a reaction time array, a mass load lift platform, a speed gate set for different distances, and in the center, a large open space with impact sensors embedded in the floor and walls. 2 station staff were managing the equipment, a quiet Peliony technician who was carefully checking calibrations, and a younger Solon in a station uniform who looked both professionally neutral and personally very interested in what was about to happen. Coordinator Pelhex was there, standing at the edge of the platform with her tablet. She looked like she hadn't planned on being there and had then decided she needed to be. The human cadets came in together, the same loose-back formation as the morning. A few of them looked around at the assembled crowd and made the small biological expressions I'd been learning to read, eyebrow positions, mouth shapes, that indicated surprise and mild discomfort at the scale of the audience. This was supposed to be optional. This was supposed to be low-key. She came in last. She looked at the crowd and didn't change her expression. The Solon technician cleared his throat. "Thank you all for attending the voluntary demonstration period. This is an informal session. No records are entered into academic standing. The purpose is to give cadets an opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that may not be fully captured by automated assessment. Participation is entirely optional. We have several stations available." He described each station. Standard stuff, the kind of equipment used in advanced capability testing for cadets who might be tracking for specialized programs. High-end, but not extreme. The mass load lift platform maxed out at about 4 times the average cadet's body weight, calibrated for the largest Dorani cadets who sometimes applied to heavy engineering tracks. For a while, nothing happened. Then a Kelvari cadet went to the speed gate and ran a trial. Good result, nothing surprising. 2 Dorani cadets tested the mass load platform. Cheval lifted near the maximum with what looked like moderate effort, and the crowd made appreciative sounds. The reaction time array got several takers. The materials testing rig got a few. Everyone was being very normal, very deliberate. You could feel the crowd wanting something specific to happen and trying not to want it too obviously. Then one of the human cadets, not her, a male, broad-shouldered, easy-mannered, walked over to the mass load platform and shrugged like he was trying something for fun. He set it to 200 kilograms, which is above average but not extreme. Lifted it cleanly. Reset, set it to 250. Lifted that, reset, set it to 300. The crowd watched. He lifted that too. He set it to 350. The crowd got quieter. He lifted 350. He put it down, rolled his shoulders, and walked away from the platform like he'd been testing whether a door would open rather than lifting nearly 4 times his own body weight. The room took a collective moment to process that. And then someone, I couldn't see who, said fairly clearly in translated cooperative standard, "The sensors really weren't wrong this morning, were they?" The moment when she lifted her hand. I want to be careful here, because I've thought about this so many times and I want to tell it right. She hadn't done anything yet. Through all of this, the murmuring, the corridor conversations, the dinner observations, the other human cadets' weight platform performance, she'd been present and quiet. She'd watched the demonstration session without appearing to react much to any of it. When the broad-shouldered male walked away from the platform, she'd looked at him briefly, and he'd looked at her, and something had passed between them that I couldn't read. Then a group of cadets, not maliciously, I want to be clear about this, started talking near the platform, loudly enough to carry. They were Velhari, a species from the inner rim who communicate in a very direct mode that other species often read as aggressive even when it isn't. Two of them were discussing the demonstration data in terms that, while not exactly hostile, were dismissive in a particular way. Category 2 at most, one of them said. Adjusted Category 2, even accounting for the anomalous readings. The platform result was in the standard large species range. The endurance data from the running assessment was more interesting. Interesting, sure. But interesting isn't Deathworlder. The Deathworlder thesis requires sustained output across all parameters: strength, endurance, pain tolerance, environmental resistance, regeneration, simultaneously and significantly exceeding standard Category 2 maximums. One cadet lifting 350 doesn't prove a category. Fair, I'm just saying the morning data was. Anomalous, possibly, or the sensors flagged for other reasons. I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying the evidence doesn't support reclassification. They weren't being aggressive. They were genuinely reasoning. But the word Deathworlder sat in the open air of the hall, and everyone in the room heard it. The quiet human cadet was standing about 10 feet from this conversation. She heard it. She looked at the Velhari cadets for a moment. Then she looked at the floor. Then she looked up at the assessment stations. Something moved behind her eyes, that thing I'd noticed on the running track. That turning on. She walked to the center of the hall. Not to any of the stations. To the open floor space, the one with the impact sensors embedded in the surfaces. She stopped in the middle of it. The hall noticed, the murmuring quieted. She stood there for a moment. Her hands were at her sides. Then she raised her right hand. Just raised it. Open palm out to the side, approximately shoulder height. The Solon technician said, carefully, "Cadet, is there something you'd like to demonstrate?" She said, and I remember this exactly because the room was so quiet that her voice carried without any amplification. "I'd like to run the environment resistance sequence, if that's available." The Solon technician looked at Coordinator Pelhex. Coordinator Pelhex looked at her tablet, then at the human cadet, then at her tablet again. That sequence isn't typically offered to first-year enrollment cadets. It's a specialized assessment normally reserved for. "I know," the human cadet said. "I'm requesting it voluntarily." Another look between Pelhex and the technician. "The environment resistance sequence," Virith breathed next to me. "Do you know what that is?" I shook my head. "It's the one they use for cadets applying to extreme environment tracks. Search and rescue, deep space, hazard response. It measures thermal tolerance, pressure resistance, pain response under controlled stimulus, atmospheric filtering, and sustained output under compound stress." She paused. "The full sequence is the most demanding physical assessment the station has. It's calibrated for species applying to the most physically extreme programs available." "And she's asking to run it, on enrollment day 1. "Yes," Virith said. The room waited. Coordinator Pelhex set her tablet down. "Set up the sequence," she said to the technician. "Standard certification level." The sequence. Let me try to describe what the environment resistance sequence actually involves, because understanding it matters for understanding what happened. The center floor space converts, via retractable panels in the ceiling and walls, into an enclosed test chamber. This took about 4 minutes while we all watched in a silence that was the loudest silence I've ever been inside. Panels slid into place. Equipment locked in. The chamber became a sealed space about 15 meters across with transparent observation panels on all sides so the audience could watch. Standard certification level for the sequence involves 4 phases. Phase 1, thermal variance. The chamber temperature drops to approximately minus 30 degrees Celsius over 5 minutes, then climbs to plus 55 over the following 5. The candidate is assessed on physical function maintenance across the full range. Phase 2, atmospheric pressure drop. The chamber air pressure reduces to 60% of standard, simulating high-altitude or partial vacuum conditions. Candidates with implanted oxygen processing assistance are allowed to use it. Those without must manage on natural capacity. Phase 3, sustained load under compound stress. The candidate performs a prescribed series of physical tasks, pulling, lifting, carrying, climbing, while the chamber environment is simultaneously degraded. This is the phase that ends most attempts. Phase 4, controlled pain stimulus. A minor but measurable electrical current, calibrated per species pain threshold, applied in a pattern while the candidate completes a basic cognitive task. This phase assesses composure, information processing capability, and fine motor control under acute stress. Most cadets who run this sequence for advanced program application are prepared specifically for it. They know it's coming. They've trained. They know their own tolerances. They've been assessed and pre-approved. She walked in having asked for it 20 minutes ago, on the first day of enrollment, without any preparation, in front of 260 cadets of 30 different species who were watching because they didn't know whether she was about to prove something or embarrass herself. The chamber sealed. Phase 1 began. I'm going to try to tell you what it looked like from outside, because that's what I saw. I can only tell you what I saw. The temperature dropped. You could see the vapor starting to form around her breath first. She was standing in the center of the chamber, arms slightly away from her body, and when the cold started hitting, she just settled. Her posture didn't change. Her breathing, visible in the vapor, stayed measured. She blinked a couple of times. That was all. Most cadets in thermal testing at that level show visible distress by the 3rd minute. Shivering, postural tightening, reflexive self-warming behaviors. She showed none of it. At the 5-minute mark at -30, she looked like someone standing in a slightly cool room. When the heat phase started, she turned her palms outward slightly. That was the only adjustment she made. As the temperature climbed toward 55, her skin, visible on her hands and face, started to flush, which is a human thermal response I later learned is an active cooling mechanism rather than distress. She sweated. Her breathing changed fractionally. But she stayed standing, she stayed calm, and when the temperature maxed and held, she was still fully upright and operational. The crowd in the hall had gotten very, very quiet. Phase 2, the pressure drop. You could see the moment it started because the air in the chamber shifted, a subtle visual distortion as pressure changed. For most candidates, the pressure drop triggers immediate physiological response. Dizziness, disorientation, compensatory behaviors. The Solon technician later told me that the average candidate shows observable stress response within 90 seconds of initiation. At 90 seconds, she was doing slow, deliberate breathing exercises. Nothing dramatic, structured, in through the nose, controlled out. Her face was entirely composed. Her eyes were focused on the middle distance, which I later learned is a concentration technique, giving the visual system a rest point while the body works. She swayed once very slightly at around the 3-minute mark, and then she caught herself and was still. She made it through the full pressure phase. The hall wasn't silent anymore. There was sound, low, varied, the murmur of 260 beings who were watching something they didn't have a framework for. I heard at least 3 different languages being spoken in urgent whispers around me. Viarith was gripping her tablet so tightly that the casing was making a small, stressed material sound. Phase 3, sustained load under compound stress. The chamber reconfigured. A series of load-bearing equipment deployed from the walls, weighted cables, a climbing structure, a series of mass blocks. The temperature and pressure both degraded simultaneously as the physical tasks began. She was going to be lifting and climbing and pulling in -15 degrees at 70% pressure, with both variables getting worse as she progressed. She started moving. And this is where I run out of adequate language again. Because it wasn't that she was effortless. She wasn't. You could see the strain. You could see the moment when a weighted cable required more than casual effort, the set of her jaw, the shift in her weight, the controlled exhale. You could see her registering the cold and the thin air and the cumulative physical demand. But she kept going, and going, and she didn't stop. The prescribed task sequence for certification level has 47 individual movements. It's designed to fatigue candidates progressively to the point where most reach their individual ceiling at some point in the sequence and either stop voluntarily or are stopped by the safety system. Average completion rate for well-prepared advanced candidates is around 60% of the sequence. Full completion is rare. She completed the sequence. 47 movements in degraded thermal and pressure conditions on enrollment day 1. When the last cable pulled free and the sensor array logged completion, the compound stress conditions stopped and the chamber environment stabilized. She stood in the center of the space, breathing in the particular way of someone who has just asked their body for a significant amount. And she was flushed, and her hands were slightly trembling, and she looked completely, entirely human. But she was standing. The hall was completely still. Phase 4 and what it actually revealed. The Solon technician's voice came through the chamber intercom, and to his credit it was professionally steady. Phase 4 is the controlled stimulus. Cadet, you are not required to continue. Certification requires phases 1 through 3 only. Phase 4 is supplemental. She looked at the intercom panel. I know, she said, continue. The cognitive task deployed. A holographic display with a sequence-matching exercise, standard complexity. The kind of thing a mid-level enrollment cadet could complete easily under normal conditions. The point of it in Phase 4 is to assess degradation of cognitive and fine motor function under pain stimulus. The current initiated. I'm not going to dramatize this. It was controlled, safe. The station's safety systems would have cut it if the readings went outside safe parameters. It was calibrated to her species' documented pain threshold, which meant it was calibrated to Category 2 human parameters. Later, one of the station's medical staff, quietly, to a colleague in a corridor, while not knowing I was in earshot, said that the current level for Category 2 human calibration, based on the standard sensitivity data in the registry, should have produced significant and observable distress response that would substantially impair cognitive task performance. She completed the cognitive task in 93% of the time she would have needed without any stimulus. She made one error. One, on a sequence she'd never practiced, in conditions she'd never trained for on the first day of enrollment with a current running through her. When the stimulus ended and the chamber began to open, the hall stayed silent for a long moment. Then Cheval, enormous, gentle Cheval, made a sound in the Dorani frequency. I don't have the translation for it exactly. The closest equivalent in cooperative standard is something like witnessed and remembered. Other cadets joined it, not applause, something else, something that felt older than applause. She walked out of the chamber. She was breathing hard. Her hands were still slightly unsteady. She had a faint red mark on her left forearm where the thermal stress had been most concentrated. She looked in this moment completely physically human, tired and real and a little raw. She also looked like she hadn't doubted for a single moment that she was going to walk out. Resolution: what happened after. Coordinator Pelhex was on her tablet before the chamber was fully open. I could see her from where I was sitting, and her expression was the controlled, careful look of someone who is processing significant new information and maintaining professional composure while doing it. The Velhari cadets who had been discussing the Deathworlder classification near the platform were very quiet. The human cadet came to the edge of the floor space. Her pack, the other 8 humans, were there. The broad-shouldered male with the weight platform lifted a hand toward her. She lifted one back. That was the full exchange. No words, no performance. Just 2 people confirming to each other that things were as expected. Viorith was writing in her tablet, fast. What are you doing? I asked. Recording, she said, before I forget anything. I looked around the hall. Other cadets were also writing, speaking quietly into personal recording devices, doing exactly what Viorith was doing. The room had the quality of people who know they've witnessed something important and are trying to make sure they remember it correctly. The Solon technician cleared his throat gently. The voluntary demonstration period is now concluded. All session data will be submitted to the central registry for review. Cadets are encouraged to return to dormitories for the scheduled rest period. Tomorrow's schedule begins at 6 station time. Nobody moved for a moment. Then gradually people started starting moving, but slowly. The way you leave a room where something happened, not wanting to break the air. I stayed until most people had gone. I was watching the human cadet, She'd accepted a hydration pack from somewhere and was drinking from it in the methodical way that I'd started recognizing as her approach to everything, complete, functional, no excess. Two Kelvari cadets approached her cautiously and said something I couldn't hear. She listened. She answered. They nodded. Whatever she said, they left looking like people who have had something reorganized in their heads. Coordinator Pelhex crossed the floor and stopped in front of her. They spoke for about 3 minutes. I watched without being able to hear. The human cadet listened more than she spoke. At the end, Pelhex said something that made the cadet nod once carefully, and then Pelhex walked away. I found out later, this took several days, through the station's inevitable information currents, what the Central Registry sent back when Pelhex filed her assessment report. It was a document requesting clarification on several specific data points. It noted that the recorded outputs were outside standard Category 2 parameters and required specialist review. It referenced a section of the registry taxonomy labeled Under Active Assessment, a section that, according to the document, had been created 14 months earlier in response to a pattern of anomalous data submissions from multiple cooperative enrollment stations. It did not use the word Deathworlder, but 14 months of anomalous data from multiple stations, before this day, before Hall 7. They'd been seeing the data from other stations, other enrollment cycles, other human cadets. They'd been looking quietly at the numbers, and the numbers kept coming back wrong. Wrong by the registry, right by something else. The conversations that followed. Over the next week, Hall 7 enrollment became the most talked-about cohort in the station's recent memory. Not loudly. Nobody was making announcements. But in the corridors, in the mess hall, in the study bays at night, when cadets were honest with each other in the way you get honest when you're far from home, and surrounded by strangers who are becoming, slowly, something like friends. I talked to her twice. The first time was 2 days after the demonstration. I was in the station library. They called it the information atrium, which sounds grander than it actually is, a medium-sized room with terminals and some biologically accommodating seating. And she was there, reading from a tablet. I almost didn't say anything. Then I did. The demonstration, I said, the other night. She looked up. She had a considering quality to her attention. She gave you her full focus when she looked at you, which could feel intense if you weren't expecting it. What about it? Why did you do it? You didn't have to. She was quiet for a moment, not in a dismissive way, in the way of someone actually thinking before they answer. The senior cadet in the second rotation, the one who did the weight platform, he asked me the same thing, she said. I told him honestly that I wasn't planning to, but then they were talking, the Velhari cadets, about what the data proved and what it didn't prove, and she paused. I guess I got tired of being a Category 2 anomaly. If the data is going to say something, it should say the right thing. Were you nervous? Yes, she said immediately, like she wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. The pressure phase is rough. I've trained in low-pressure environments, but never that fast a drop, and the thermal range was wider than I'm used to. She looked at her left forearm, where the faint mark from the heat phase was still visible, fading. I made one mistake on the cognitive task. One is too many, she said, not with distress, just as a fact. I thought about that for a moment. Where you're from, I said, is it? I didn't know how to finish the question. She looked at me steadily. Rough, she said. Yes, it's a rough place. She said it without drama, without pride, without apology, just true. Do all humans? No, she said. We're not all the same. Earth is a big planet with a lot of different environments and a lot of different people. But the baseline, the basic biology, is shaped by what the planet is. What it's always been, she considered. Think of it this way. If you want to make something that survives, you make it out of the conditions of survival. Earth spent 4 billion years doing that, with a result. 4 billion years of survival conditions, walking around in enrollment whites in Hall 7. The second conversation was shorter. 3 days later. She was in the equipment bay, adjusting the calibration on her personal kit, and I stopped because I'd been thinking about something. Vieri thinks the registry is going to reclassify, I said. Not all humans, but as a category, as a recognition that Category 2 isn't accurate. She looked up. I know. Does that change anything for you? She thought about it, actually thought. It changes what they put in the database, she said. It doesn't change what I am, what any of us are. We were whatever this is before anyone named it. She went back to the calibration adjustment. Names are for the people who need to know what to expect. The aftermath. There is an official footnote in the Calthuran Station enrollment records for cycle 447. I know because I've checked years later, when I had the clearance to look, that reads, Physical assessment data for human cadets submitted for registry review under anomalous parameters protocol. Follow-up investigation initiated. See Registry File Ks 447H. Registry File Ks 447H, when it was eventually released in a partially redacted summary form, described the systematic review of anomalous human cadet data from 23 enrollment stations across 3 galactic quadrants spanning a 7-year period. It described the pattern of flagged force output readings, endurance projections, environmental resilience markers, and cognitive stability metrics that kept appearing and kept getting filed as sensor error, because nothing else in the taxonomy made sense of them. It described the formal opening of a category taxonomy review species designation, Human Project, which ran for 4 years and involved xenobiologists, biomechanical specialists, environmental evolution researchers, and 3 independent review boards. It did not, in the partially released version, include the final classification. But in the corridors of Calthuran Station, in the week following the voluntary demonstration period, in the quiet conversations between cadets from 30 different species who had all been in Hall 7 or heard from someone who had, a word was moving. Quietly, without official sanction. It was the word they'd told us was mythological. Deathworlder. And the thing about that word, the thing I kept coming back to, was that it wasn't being used as an accusation or a warning or even as awe, exactly. It was being used the way you use a word when you finally have the right container for something you've been looking at without being able to name. Like relief. Reflection, what I've thought about since. I'm a practicing biomechanical liaison now. I've been one for 11 years. I work at the interface between species-specific medical systems and cooperative standard equipment calibration. It's less interesting to explain than it sounds, but it matters, and I find I like work that matters more than work that sounds impressive. The human cadet, I should tell you her name. I've called her she and the human cadet because that's how I think of her in that memory, in that hall, in those early days when I didn't know her yet. Her name is Sira Kowalczyk. She graduated 3 cycles later in the upper percentile of her class from the Ardennes Advanced Operations Academy, specialized in high-risk environment navigation, and as of the last information I have, is doing something that the official records describe carefully as active field coordination, in a sector I'm not cleared to know details about. We stayed in contact, the Hall 7 cohort, the way that people do when they've been through something together without intending to. Not close, not constant, but periodic, honest. The kind of contact that picks up easily after gaps because it's built on something real. I asked her once, years later, whether she'd known what would happen that night. Whether she'd known that the demonstration would shift something. She said she hadn't. She said she'd just been tired, genuinely tired. The kind of tired you get from being measured and classified and filed away in a category that doesn't fit. And she'd wanted, for once, to give the sensors accurate data. Just accurate data, she said, that's all. But that's the thing about accurate data, when you've been working with wrong data for so long. Accurate data changes everything. The morning after the voluntary demonstration period, Coordinator Pelhex ran the Day 2 briefing exactly on schedule. She went through the day's itinerary. She covered administrative items. She was, as always, precise and thorough. At the end, before dismissal, she paused. One additional note, she said, regarding last night's session. The data from the voluntary demonstration period has been submitted to the appropriate review channels. Cadets are reminded that all enrollment data is confidential and should not be shared externally. Any cadet with questions about their own assessment data may request a review meeting. She paused again, looked up from her tablet, looked briefly at the human cadets in their various seats around the hall. This is, she said carefully, an enrollment cohort that is going to be remembered. Then she closed her tablet and walked out. And I thought, yes, it is. I thought about 4 billion years of survival. About a planet that spent longer than most species have existed making something capable of standing in a sealed chamber in a station at the edge of the galaxy, cold and low on oxygen, and carrying a current through her nerves, and completing a cognitive task at 93% efficiency, and calling the 7% error gap too many. I thought about the hand she raised, one hand open palm, shoulder height. The smallest possible gesture, the quietest possible way to say, measure me correctly. And how that one hand, raised in the right moment, in the right room, in front of the right eyes, was enough to start unraveling a category that had never fit to begin with. There's something about that I've never been able to stop thinking about how the truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it just raises its hand and waits to be seen.